Parallel Journeys, Chapter 15, The Christmas Eve Air Attack. We didn't know it then, but our meeting with the Fuhrer was his last before he launched Germany's final all-out attack of the war. We had no idea that the end was so near. We only knew that we were working longer weeks under absolutely miserable conditions. It took superhuman effort for us to stand every day at the foot of a deep ditch, sometimes up to our knees in water, and shovel mud to the next higher level. I no longer worried about my boys' uniforms being clean. As long as they marched to work, even if they were filthy, I was satisfied. In early December 1944, the Allies at last broke through parts of the West Wall. Enemy soldiers were now standing on sacred German soil. Just south of where Alphonse was stationed, the American Third Army crossed the Saar River, posing a great threat to German troops in that area. To warn them of the danger they faced and to boost their fighting spirit, Robert Ley, a high-ranking Nazi leader, came to visit some of the Hitler Youth units, among them Alphonse's. Many top officers came with Ley, including Alphonse's Bannführer, the leader of all Hitler Youth units in Wittlich area. So impressed was Ley with the work Alphonse's boys were doing that he got right down in the ditch beside them to help dig. At the end of the day, as the officers were leaving, Alphonse's Bannführer pulled him aside. "You'll be home by the end of next week," he said. "We're starting to pull units out of here. A couple of American tanks broke through the line last night and raised all kinds of hell. Keep that under your hat. No use getting everybody excited, right?" "Things are coming to a climax fast," he continued, "and it doesn't look good. Get Roman Fallman to take over for you. Ready or not, you're on your way back to Wittlich. I need you there." "What for?" I asked, astonished. "Have you ever heard of the Volkssturm?" he replied. The Volkssturm, or People's Militia, was a last-gasp effort to save the fatherland. The German government ordered all remaining men and boys, ages 16 to 60, to register immediately for military service. Girls and women between 17 and 50 years old were also told to report. It was a pathetic fighting force. Many of the people who showed up were too old or inexperienced to serve. Had they been able, they would have been fighting already. Most of them had no military training or any idea how to handle the weapons they were given. Some brought their old hunting rifles from home. Uniforms were simply the clothes on their backs, a trench coat here, a derby hat there, some business suits, some ragged flannel shirts. The only way to tell a Volkssturm member was by the white or black and white band worn on the arm. Fighting spirit in the Volkssturm was low. Adults were afraid and discouraged. It was clear to most of them that Germany was going down in defeat. Hitler might not admit it, but the people could see it coming. This was Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The only ones still anxious to fight to the death for the fatherland were Hitler Youth members. Although the official age for the Volkssturm was 16, many younger boys now joined, fanatic fighters ready to give their lives for their Führer. Alphonse's new job was to lead all Volkssturm units in Wittlich and Bernkastel counties. "About half of your people will be from the Hitler Youth," my Bannführer explained, "but it's the older half that worries me. Some of these grandfathers have never held a rifle. We have to train them as best we can." "Does that mean," I asked, unable to hide my disappointment, "that the Luftwaffe isn't going to claim me soon? I'm a pilot, Bannführer." "Forget it," he shouted, irritated. "Are you going to argue with me? Put the Luftwaffe out of your mind for now. Do I make myself clear?" "Jawohl, Bannführer," I replied, "absolutely." As he prepared to head for Wittlich, Alphonse suddenly felt sad to be leaving the West Wall. He had made some good friends here. It was hard to say goodbye, knowing that any of them might be dead within days. "The rat is leaving the sinking ship," Roman Fallman joked as he and Hans Levitz walked Alphonse to his motorbike. Levitz's honesty had always amazed and shocked Alphonse. This battle-hardened lieutenant had long been convinced that they were serving a madman, and he was not afraid to say so. At first, Alphonse had considered Levitz a traitor to talk this way about der Führer, and yet he couldn't help but believe him. Levitz had told in vivid detail about a mass murder he had seen while serving in Russia. The SS had rounded up more than 30,000 Jewish women, children, and old men near a place called Babi Yar and machine-gunned them into a ravine. Hans had seen it with his own eyes, and it haunted him. The story sounded unbelievable, but Alphonse trusted Hans, so he had to admit it must be true. Now, as they shook hands to leave, Levitz suddenly pulled Alphonse to him. "I want you to remember, Alf, that dying for the fatherland is not as noble as living for it, no matter what anybody tells you. For God's sakes, keep that in mind when the time comes and you have a choice." One day those words would ring loudly in Alphonse's ears, but now it was time to leave. That night, 400 of my boys and I were on the road to the Sar River. We would board a train in the middle of the night, for it was too dangerous to travel in daylight. Shortly after midnight, we were loaded into passenger and freight cars. Nobody minded the boxcars. We were on our way home. A strict blackout was in effect. No light could shine from the train, for the night was loud with anti aircraft noise and the distant growl of gunfire. Before long, those sounds would be with us constantly. Germany's final all-out attack of the war, the one planned by Hitler himself, began on December 15, 1944. At 5:30 a.m. in the Ardennes forest of Luxembourg, the Germans launched a massive raid against U.S. troops stretching along a 40-mile line. Hitler's aim was to attack the line at its weakest point and push the Americans backward into Belgium. He intended to keep pushing west until he had captured the Belgian city of Antwerp. At first, it seemed like the glory days of the Blitzkrieg were back. German soldiers parachuting down behind American lines took the troops completely by surprise. For the first time in months, the Allies were on the defensive. Pressing hard, the German troops pushed one section of the American line 60 miles back into Belgium and Luxembourg. On a map, it looked like a huge bulge had formed in the line, and the attack became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Just a week later, the Germans launched another drive that trapped the American troops in a pocket near the Belgian city of Bastogne. Seeing no possible way the Americans could escape, a German officer ordered the trapped troops to surrender or face total destruction. American commander Anthony McAuliffe's reply was a clear, loud, "Nuts!" U.S. troops held their ground. Though German forces fought fiercely, they never made it to Antwerp, nor even close. On December 24th, American troops at last turned the tide of battle and began to push the Germans back toward the fatherland. As part of their attack, the Allies bombed hundreds of towns that served as supply points for the German army. Among them was Wittlich. Alphonse was there, having just arrived home from the West Wall. Christmas Eve was a cold, brilliant Sunday. The sirens began to wail at 8 in the morning. Soon, we spotted high-flying bomber formations painting scratch marks in the pale blue sky. I left our farm shortly before 2 o'clock, heading into town. On my way through the gate, I patted my dog Prinz on the head. When I get back, I promised him, I'm taking you and Felix, our horse, for a walk. I strolled through the stable, looked in on the horses, and blew softly into Felix's nostrils. The clock in the 17th century City Hall tower struck 2:30 as I crossed the marketplace. Suddenly the sirens began to wail, the insistent, ear-splitting sound of high alarm. Out of the western sun roared a wedge of bombers flying quite low. I shot through the steel door of the public air raid shelter beneath the hotel. The blast of the first exploding bomb blew the door shut, and it jammed. The lights went out, and panic gripped the 300 people crowded in the shelter. Dust and chunks of mortar rained down from the ceiling, making breathing very hard. The shrieks of terror inside the shelter never let up, but in a few moments there was a lull in the explosions outside. With the help of an old man wearing a bizarre-looking spiked army helmet from World War I, Alphonse was able to clear a path inside the shelter and open the jammed door. Amazingly, only one person in the group had been killed, a mother whose young daughter was standing right beside her. As he pressed outside into the daylight, Alphonse checked his watch. It was 2:45. The attack had taken just 15 minutes, but Wittlich was destroyed. Not a pane of glass was left in any of the buildings. The center of the city was a fiery inferno. Running toward home, Alphonse prepared himself for the worst. I raced around a garden, and there, before me, lay our farm. It was a mass of roaring flames. The outline of the burning barn was still standing, but both houses next to it were a mountain of flaming rubble. The heat struck me like a fist in the face. I cowered behind the body of a dead cow near where the stable had been and sobbed. Nothing could possibly be alive in this cauldron of destruction. A hand on his shoulder roused him from his stupor. It was his neighbor, Andreas Kaspar, asking Alphonse to come with him to another air raid shelter where his grandmother and aunts had fled. Knowing that his grandmother never took cover during air raids, Alphonse at first refused to believe him. But Herr Kaspar insisted. This time, she had. The Kaspar family was there too. The shelter located in the basement of the city power station had been buried by the attack. With heavy hearts, Alphonse and Andreas began digging. Finally, just before 9 o'clock p.m., they heard a faint knock. Miraculously, someone was alive inside. A few more minutes of clawing in the ruins, and they unearthed the steel door that covered the stairway down into the shelter. The last man in had been killed when he tried to slide the door into place, but the other 14 people were alive, among them Alphonse's family. In all, 69 people died in the Christmas Eve air attack on Wittlich. It was a tremendous loss in a small town where everyone knew each other. The fires burned out of control for 3 days. The fire station had taken a direct hit that destroyed all the equipment. To make matters worse, water lines froze in the frigid December temperatures. Our farm was one of 120 homes totally destroyed. On the third day, when the flames were out, I went back to the farm. A sickening smell hung heavy in the air. Despite the numbing cold, I lifted up a dead chicken and saw a paw under it. Probing with a shovel, I soon uncovered the body of my dog, Prince. Felix lay nearby. My mind ran wild with rage. Furiously, I began digging a hole. The ground was still soft from the heat of the fires. Sliding his body into my shovel, I laid Prince in his grave, covered him with straw, and filled the hole with dirt. I marked the spot with a piece of slate, sat down beside it, and cried until I thought my heart would break. "Oh, Prince," I sobbed, "why didn't I take you and Felix with me?" I was burning with hatred. "So you damned Amis want total war?" I seethed. "Well, you're going to get it. I'll make you pay for Prince and Felix." I realized in that moment that I no longer cared deeply for people. My animals meant much more to me. 5 days later, on the New Year's, the Luftwaffe launched its final big effort of the war. Into France, Belgium, and Holland roared some 800 German planes. They bombed Allied air bases, catching their crews off guard. Yet the day was a disaster for the Germans. The Allies lost 156 aircraft, but it cost the Luftwaffe 364 planes to bring them all down. There were no replacements in the German Air Force, for the Reich was now out of men and machinery. I had no idea that for the New Year Day attack, the Luftwaffe had ordered every boy, man, and plane to fight to the death. It didn't matter how many lives or planes were destroyed. By the end of the attack, our Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Oddly, it was at this point of near defeat that my wish finally came true. The Luftwaffe called me at last. I was ordered to report to a small base at Kassel near the center of Germany, where I was sworn in as a Fähnrich, a second lieutenant. Having dreamed for months of flying a Messerschmitt Schwab, the world's first fighter jet, I was shattered when I saw the aircraft to which I was assigned. It was a DSF 230, an ugly, stubby thing that looked like plywood duck with a plexiglass nose. A single machine gun poked through its windshield. My flying buddy Rabbit had been in a fighter squadron since September. I'd gotten letters from him telling how he had downed 2 American bombers. He would laugh himself silly to see these plywood boxcars. What Alphonse didn't realize as he envied his best friend was that Rabbit was dead. He had been shot down in the New Year's Day raid with the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. By late January, the Battle of the Bulge was lost. The bulge in the line had been ironed flat where Allied troops pushed the Wehrmacht back into Germany. This battle had cost the fatherland 220,000 men. Half were dead, the rest prisoners of war. More than 1,400 tanks and big guns had been destroyed or captured by the Allies. Thousands of buildings were damaged or turned to rubble. Hitler's plan had accomplished nothing. It had only delayed defeat. German troops were trapped now between American forces in the west and the Russian army driving hard from the east. On January 30th, 1945, on the 12th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler made his last radio broadcast. As he was speaking, Russian troops moved to within 70 miles of the capital city of Berlin. The Allies were also in control of the skies. Although they hardly needed to prove it, RAF and American bombers launched a massive airstrike against the German city of Dresden. At that moment, the city was home to thousands of refugees, women, children, old people, who were fleeing from the Russian army. The attack on Dresden was meant to break the German spirit and force Hitler to surrender. A quick end to the war would, in the long run, save more lives, the Allies claimed. But many people disagreed. They called the bombings merciless and unnecessary, mass murder by air. American author Kurt Vonnegut, who was then a prisoner of war in Dresden, later described the bombing in his book Slaughterhouse-Five. Though the death toll will never be certain, 125,000 people probably died in the firestorms that ravaged Dresden the night of February 13th. So fiercely did the fires burn that the asphalt melted from the streets. We were still numb from the news of Dresden when I learned that I would not be flying after all. For the second time in 3 weeks, my hopes were crushed. Despite my tearful plea to be assigned to flight duty, I was sent back to the Volkssturm. My Bannführer had requested me. It was in the face of this newest disappointment that I reached my highest rank in the Hitler Youth. Back at headquarters in Wittlich, I was greeted by Bannführer Wendt. We talked about the war and the condition of the Volkssturm. I hoped that he would let me keep my Hitler Youth unit separate from the older men, the old bones. They were easier to handle this way, but I needed his permission. "I'll have to leave that up to you, I'm afraid," Wendt replied casually. Why? I asked, surprised. Because, Alf, you are the next Bondführer of Bond 244 Village. I'm leaving. I was astounded. What did you say? I asked him, flabbergasted. That's impossible, Bondführer. I'm not even 17. So what? He shrugged. We're asking 12-year-olds to attack enemy tanks. So it was that at 16 years old, Alphonse Heck became a Bondführer, a rank equal to a major general in the United States Army. In all of Germany, there were only 223 Bondführer. Under his command, he now had some 6,000 troops. Heck's first order was to move his units to the town of Bitburg on the Belgian border, about 25 miles from Wittlich. This was the front. The Americans were shelling the west edge of town. Here, the Volkssturm was supposed to make a strong stand. Shortly after dawn on the second day in Bitburg, the Amis attacked close to Alphonse's unit. To my left, 3 Hitler Youth boys frantically pushed a heavy machine gun over the rim of the trench in which they'd been hiding. I shouted, "Keep the MG down until the enemy gets within range." The gunner, who was perhaps 14, looked at me gratefully and pulled the barrel back. "Will you help us set it up?" he asked. Although the boys were excited and nervous, they hid their fear quite well. No one ran. Then, out of the swirling fog rose the turret of a Sherman tank. "Panzerfaust!" someone shouted. Half a dozen Hitler Youth boys jumped immediately out of the trench, crouched on top of it, and aimed their pipe-like weapons. The tank opened fire on us with its cannon. I ignored my own order and began shooting at the turret. Everybody in our trench followed, firing wildly. We could hear cries of men as they were hit. A figure dressed in khaki clothes stood up and fired a full round from his submachine gun. When he turned, he was mowed down. I have no idea whether myself or someone else hit him. It was a hail of rifle fire. Less than a half hour later, the second attack began. Bombs, cannon, and machine gun fire turned most of our trenches into sand-filled wreckage. When it was over, I was very proud that our boys had so willingly risked their lives for the fatherland. We saluted 2 of our young comrades who had died during the action. Their families and close friends probably cried for them, but we didn't. By now, we had seen too much death. Too many of our friends had been killed. We were beyond tears. I grieved much more for my dog, Prince, and my gentle horse, Felix. They were innocent victims, after all. They had never pledged an oath to the Fuhrer.